What if I told you that Persia did not simply become Iran, but made a choice about what kind of power it believed in? For thousands of years, that land stood at the crossroads of civilization. Empires rose and fell around it, but under Ciro o Grande, Persia built something revolutionary for its time, a superpower that ruled not only with armies but with tolerance, religious freedom, cultural autonomy, local governance preserved under imperial order. In many ways, it was centuries ahead of its era, but history does not move in straight lines. Centuries later, from the very same soil, another revolution would emerge, not to expand tolerance, but to redefine authority itself. This time, power would not flow from pluralism or negotiated order. It would flow from ideology, from divine mandate, from a single unchallengeable vision, and standing across that ideological divide was a nation far younger, imperfect, controversial, but built on a radical experiment that changed the modern world. That legitimacy does not descend from kings, clerics, or conquerors, but rises from the consent of the governed. That nation was the Estados Unidos. This is not just the story of how Persia became Iran. It is the story of two philosophies of power, one that sees authority as something preserved, protected, and enforced. The other that sees authority as something granted and revocable. One model rooted in historical continuity and sacred permanence, the other rooted in constitutional limits and individual liberty. Two civilizations, two systems, two futures. And when those visions collided in the 20th century, the consequences did not remain confined to one region. They reshaped alliances, wars, revolutions, and the balance of power across the globe. Because sometimes a name change is not a rebranding, it is a declaration. A declaration of which values a nation will defend and which values it will challenge. And that choice still echoes today. If we are to understand how that choice was made, we have to return to the beginning, not to 1935, not to 1979, but to a plateau of mountains and deserts where identity was forged long before modern borders existed, long before oil, before superpowers, before sanctions and headlines. The Iranian plateau was already a strategic crossroads. A tribe speaking Indo-European languages settled there in the second millennium before Christ, distant linguistic cousins of the cultures that would one day shape Europe. They were not Arab, they were not defined by Islam, they were something older. Among them rose the Persians, and from them emerged a figure who would permanently alter the architecture of power, Ciro o Grande. Cyrus did not merely conquer, he unified. He absorbed Babylon without annihilating it. He allowed displaced peoples, including the Jews exiled there, to return home. He ruled through a system that respected local traditions while maintaining imperial coherence. It was not democracy in the modern sense, but it was a sophisticated balance between centralized strength and cultural flexibility. In a brutal ancient world, that balance was revolutionary. Under his successors, especially Darius I, the empire stretched from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean. Roads connected provinces. Bureaucrats recorded taxes and decrees. A communication system moved messages across thousands of miles with astonishing efficiency. Persia became what many historians consider the first true superpower. But every superpower eventually meets a rival. In 334 BC, a young Macedonian king crossed into Asia Minor with an army far smaller than the one he would confront. Alexandre o Grande defeated the Persians in a series of decisive battles and dismantled the Achaemenid Empire. Yet in a twist that history rarely emphasizes, he did not attempt to erase Persian civilization. He adopted elements of it. He wore its garments, married into its nobility, preserved its administrative system. Even in conquest, Persia proved culturally gravitational. It influenced its conqueror. That pattern would repeat. Arab armies in the 7th century brought Islam, toppling the Sasanian dynasty, and permanently transforming the region's religious identity. Persian elites converted. A Persian language absorbed Arabic vocabulary, and Islam became dominant. Yet the Persian cultural core endured in poetry, philosophy, science, and governance. Later came Turks, Mongols, and competing dynasties, each ruling the land but never dissolving its identity. Over time, a uniquely Persian expression of Islam crystallized, especially under the Safavids in the 16th century, who made Twelver Shi'ism the official state doctrine. That decision would set the region apart from its predominantly Sunni neighbors and define its political theology for centuries. By the early 20th century, the land known internationally as Persia faced a different kind of invasion, not armies this time, but influence. European powers maneuvered for access to resources and trade routes. Oil transformed the region from historic crossroads to strategic prize. In 1935, seeking modernization and sovereignty, Reza Shah Pahlavi formally requested that foreign governments use the country's indigenous name, Iran. It was a symbolic assertion of national dignity, a rejection of exoticized narratives imposed from abroad. Yet symbolism alone could not shield the country from the geopolitical storm gathering over the 20th century. After the Second World War, the global order hardened into a bipolar confrontation between the Estados Unidos and the Union Sovietica. In that context, the Middle East was no longer merely historical terrain, it was strategic high ground. When Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized Iran's oil industry in 1951, challenging British control, the move was celebrated domestically as an assertion of sovereignty. But in Washington and London, it raised fears of instability and potential Soviet expansion. The Cold War was not an abstract chessboard, it was an existential struggle between competing systems. In 1953, in a covert operation supported by the CIA and the MI6, helped remove Mossadegh and restore monarchical authority under Mohammad Reza Shah. To some, that intervention was a necessary act of containment in a dangerous era. To others inside Iran, it was a wound, proof that foreign powers could still tilt the balance of their destiny. For the United States, the calculation was strategic: prevent Soviet encroachment, maintain regional stability, protect energy flows critical to the global economy. For many Iranians, however, the memory lingered as humiliation, and history has a way of storing unresolved grievances. By 1979, pressure built into revolution. Led by Ruhollah Khomeini, mass protests toppled the Shah and replaced the monarchy with an Islamic republic grounded in clerical authority. The new regime rejected Western influence and positioned itself as a guardian of revolutionary Shiite ideology. The hostage crisis that followed shattered diplomatic relations with the United States and cemented mutual distrust. From that point forward, the relationship was no longer merely geopolitical, it became ideological. Here, the divergence between the two models sharpened. On one side stood a republic built on constitutional mechanisms, periodic elections, and institutional checks, messy, polarized, but self-correcting over time. On the other stood a system where ultimate authority rested with a supreme religious leader, insulated from electoral removal. Both claimed legitimacy, both invoked sovereignty, but their foundations differed fundamentally. As decades passed, tensions radiated outward. Support for proxy groups across the Middle East placed Iran at odds with regional actors and with Israel. Disputes over nuclear development intensified scrutiny and sanctions. Each escalation reinforced a narrative inside Iran of resistance against Western pressure, while in Washington, the issue was framed as deterrence against destabilization. The United States positioned itself as guarantor of a broader security architecture, protecting shipping lanes, supporting allies, attempting to prevent nuclear proliferation. Critics debated methods, but the underlying principle remained consistent: maintain a balance that prevents any single ideological power from dominating the region. And so we arrive at the present. The name Iran now evokes for many Americans images of confrontation, yet beneath headlines lies a deeper historical arc. A civilization that once pioneered imperial tolerance transformed across centuries of invasion, adaptation, and revolution into a state defined by religious guardianship and strategic defiance. Meanwhile, the United States, once a distant experiment across the Atlantic, emerged as the central architect of a global order based on alliances, trade networks, and constitutional governance. The collision between these trajectories was not inevitable, but once set in motion, it reshaped the modern Middle East. So did Persia become Iran? Yes, but more importantly, it chose, through revolutions, reforms, and reactions, which pillars would define its authority. And the United States chose as well, to defend a model where power is constrained by law and leadership can be replaced without bloodshed. History is rarely a tale of villains and heroes. It is a contest of systems, pressures, and decisions made under uncertainty. Yet one distinction remains clear. Empires of the ancient world sought permanence through continuity of rule. The American experiment sought endurance through change, through the idea that stability is strongest when citizens, not rulers, hold the final voice. In the end, the transformation from Persia to Iran was not merely linguistic, it was civilizational, and the ongoing tension with the United States is not simply diplomatic friction, it is the meeting point of two visions of legitimacy, one anchored in sacred authority, the other in constitutional consent. That is why the story still matters, because as long as those visions coexist on the world stage, the question is no longer what Persia was called, but which future will prove more resilient.